Hello again, my lovely little tea protectors. Or hello for the first time, if indeed it is. I'm pleased you're here for episode 6 of our journey through the wonderful world of Camellia sinensis. I'm Sam. Have you ever bought yourself a tin of tea that's a step above what you normally drink and gotten all giddy when the postman handed it to you, and went straight to the kitchen and warmed your kettle and steeped your leaves and took that first sip, and it was the most magnificent taste your taste buds ever did taste, and you told yourself that such a divine elixir as this must be savoured only on occasion, lest it lose its lustre, and packed it away, and then tried it again after a few months, and noticed it wasn't quite as magnificent or lustrous or elixiry as you remembered? Well, perhaps you were a victim of the honeymoon phase of getting a fancy new tea. In which case, I don't know how to help you, sorry. Or perhaps nothing changed about the tea, and the fault is yours, and you've ruined it just like you ruin everything else. Oh, settle down, I'm kidding. But for real, depending on how you've ruined it, this might actually be not that bad, or might even be completely reversible. And this leads us into today's topic: the do's and don'ts of tea storage. When it comes to storage, the 4 horsemen of the tea-pocalypse are oxygen, light, heat, and moisture. Oxygen is probably the most persistent of the bunch, so I'll begin there. When we talk about tea being sensitive to oxygen, we're talking mostly about your catechins. These molecules are prone to oxidation, the same thing that gives most tea its flavour when it's being initially processed. But over-oxidizing binds them together into larger molecules that are way less effective as antioxidants and make your tea taste less like tea and more like kale. Don't get me wrong, kale is fine, as long as it's in a smoothie with a bunch of yummy things that make you forget you're also drinking kale. I just don't want to drink it without any of those yummy things while I'm trying to relax. And the most surefire way to not find yourself drinking hot kale water while you're trying to relax is to make sure you're storing your leaves in some kind of airtight container. Depending on what they came in, this could mean just keeping your leaves in their original packaging and making sure to shut it again as soon as you're done getting your tea out. Now that may have you thinking you should go buy a bunch of Kilner jars with the fancy clamping lids and line up all your teas on the back edge of the counter, or, heaven forbid, the windowsill, all colour coordinated because you're going for a cottagecore aesthetic. I'm warning you explicitly, aesthetic as that is, it's also a terrible way to store tea leaves. This is because light, specifically the UV rays from the sun, expose the leaves to a process called photooxidation. It's essentially just a faster version of regular oxidation leaves go through when exposed to air, so transparent jars are generally not recommended. That's not to say that you can't use them, you just need to be uber aware of where you're keeping them, like in a cupboard or somewhere else natural light can't reach. Could you swap out the transparent glass jars for opaque ceramic ones and then do the windowsill thing? Also no. Well, maybe. If you live where I do, where the temperature hardly ever changes and the sun never fully comes out. But even then it's a risk because of moisture or condensation. These can be a bit tricky because with moisture, your leaves can actually go bad both ways. Too much moisture surrounding your leaves and they'll start to rot over time, which can introduce bacteria and give your tea an acidic, fermented taste and smell, like a bad pu'er, because that's what's happening to your leaves on a cellular level. It's uncontrolled fermentation. The easiest ways to tell if your leaves are starting to ferment are a darker than expected colour, which is easier to identify with lighter teas, an acidic aroma, and in some cases, they can even feel more pliable between your fingers. This last one is easier to identify in darker teas due to the higher relative moisture already present in white or green tea leaves. Conversely, if your leaves are too dry, your cup will taste stale and flat, without any of that wonderful vegetal flavour that freshly steeped leaves have. The way to tell if your leaves are too dry is either by smell, which will resemble an old attic or basement, or by taste, which might be thin and watery, meaning the flavour has dulled, or might be musty, like when you empty out the hoover and accidentally breathe a little bit of the dust in. I've heard accounts of people being able to tell by touch, particularly with lighter teas, as they will feel less pliable to a discerning set of fingers, though personally, I've never been able to tell this way. To undo the damage caused by either too much or too little moisture, one thing you can do is to very lightly roast your leaves. This can be done in a hojiki, pardon the pronunciation, a special roasting pan made for Japanese green tea leaves, which is designed to roast them very mildly without burning or browning them. This also makes it ideal for roasting away some of the unpleasant smell associated with off teas, although you'll unlikely be able to get rid of all of it, as well as removing some of the excess moisture if you happen to have moist leaves. There's a particular method to using a hojiki, which is to put your leaves in, not the whole lot, about 10 grams, and heat them over medium heat until you start to notice your leaves becoming more fragrant. Then, take them off the heat and gently swirl the hojiki in a circular motion. This ensures the leaves get a roughly even roast. The process, more or less, is a shorter variation of how you make hojicha, Japanese roasted green tea. You don't want the leaves to brown, like what you'd look for if you were actually making hojicha. All you're trying to do is open up your flavour profiles. So when you start to notice that your leaves are starting to smell like fresh leaves again, it's best to call it. I'm going to make a disclaimer now that a lot of these numbers are estimates, because the specifics of what you want depend largely on the type of tea you're using, whether they're moist or dry, and how far from normal they are. And if you have a hojiki and plan to use it for a refresh roast, or are considering getting one, please spend some time looking up how to use it from an actual tutorial, because it can be a bit finicky. If you don't have a hojiki, you can always oven roast your leaves, but there are a few caveats. First, it really helps to have a clean oven that doesn't smell like a bunch of different food, unless you really liked last week's stew and want some more of it in your tea. Second, be super careful about it, like no more than 75 degrees Celsius or 165 Fahrenheit for around 20 minutes, and definitely don't try to do the whole batch at once, unless you've done it before and know how much it needs. It's easy to overdo it in an oven, which is why it's much easier in a hojiki, because the leaves are right there to see and smell. When you're done, be sure to let them rest until they get back down to room temperature. Otherwise, you'll just steam up your container and end up back at square one. Then, to keep yourself from having to do all this again in the future, store your leaves at a relative humidity between about 40 and 60%. Unfortunately, there's not a super reliable way I found to tell outside of a hygrometer, which is a special little sensor that measures relative humidity. But the good news is, hygrometers are cheap, and the damage that moisture can do to your leaves can be offset somewhat by minimizing the other three factors. I'll get to that in just a moment, after I introduce the fourth horseman, heat. This can be the worst of the ensemble, because the opposite of what I just said about moisture is true for heat. Moisture damage can be minimized if oxygen, light, and heat are under control, because at the end of the day, there is some amount of moisture in every leaf, and depending on the type of tea you're working with, a bit of extra fermentation can enhance the taste. But poor temperature regulation can make the other three much worse. It doesn't matter if you keep your leaves in double-lidded tins and store them under perfectly dry conditions if you're also baking them at low heat for months and months. And heat damage to your leaves can't really be undone. So the best thing to do is find a good spot to put your tea where it won't be exposed to wild swings in temperature. For optimal storage, your tea really wants to be chilling out between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius, or 60 to 70 Fahrenheit. Once you start hitting temperatures more than just a few degrees beyond that, your little leaves start to panic. This heat causes a rapid degradation of amino acids, the stuff that gives tea its sweetness and umami flavour, and catechins, which, if you've been paying attention, you would know that once those start to break down, oxidation starts to pick up again. The best place to store your tea, without relying on a bunch of gadgets to determine your exact environmental conditions, is generally going to be somewhere more toward the centre of your home, away from light and heat sources, on a lower shelf away from sinks, dishwashers or ovens if you have them, and ideally in an airtight container of some kind. Jars work fine, tins work even better because glass is a good heat insulator, whereas metal evens itself out to the ambient temperature. And pantries are great provided you're not keeping your leaves near anything super fragrant. Well, that about covers it, friends. Turns out it really isn't difficult to take care of your leaves. Keep them cool, keep them dark, keep them dry. And for heaven's sake, keep the lid closed. Treat your leaves like the fragile treasures they are, and maybe next time your fancy bug-bitten oolong won't taste like it came out of a plastic bottle you picked up at the corner shop. Until next time, darlings, mwah! Enjoy your lives, and always remember, steep, sip, stay curious.